what, Romans 8 or 9? Jacob I love. So maybe this chapter will love.
Yeah,
Maybe
I think it will. Because truthfully, it's pretty much the same as the last chapter with one minor change.
Okay.
Actually, major change, but pretty obvious. Well, not always obvious. So, all right. So, getting a late start here. Appreciate you guys. Sorry about that. I was in the wrong class. So, anyway, we want to begin here and continue in our look at the basic and biblical Greek from chapter 22, second aorist, active, and middle indicative verbs. So, I'm going to dive in, and we'll try to go through and answer any questions as we go. So let me just kind of move forward here. Let's see. All right. So the great thing about the second aorist, number one, it's very much like in some ways, at least its form. Well, let me say this properly. It's going to be similar to what you did in the imperfect. Okay, it's certainly going to reflect a past kind of action. We'll talk about that in a moment. And it's going to look pretty much similar. We'll talk about how to tell the difference between an imperfect and a second aorist. But in English, the Greek really does the same thing as English does. In English, we have two different types of past action. We have what's called a regular or weak action, like I studied. I guess it's weak because we add a D or an ED to it, right? I studied, versus what's called the irregular or strong a past kind of verb. And that's where we change the form of the verb. I ate. Well, I have looked at some examples here. Let me look at what I wrote down very quickly. So I added, I earned, I damaged, or that would be a weak form or regular, right? But the strong or irregular form would be like I blow, I blew, or I've blown, or have been blown. Or I do, I did, I done. I speak, I spoke, or I spoken. I lie, I lay, or I lain. I swim, I swam. Swim, I swam, I swum. In those cases, they actually change the form. They change the stem of the word to reflect a past, present, or future ongoing kind of action. And Greek does the same thing. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the second aorist is where the form is going to be different than the present tense stem. We use a different tense stem. We use the aorist tense stem. And hence, so just like in English, we just basically use a different form of the verb to give it a past tense meaning. And we're going to do the same thing in Greek. So it's not really totally new. It's just going to feel new. But also we're building off that imperfect. And that makes it a little bit easier to understand, but we have to be able to differentiate between the imperfect and the second aorist. So we'll talk about that. Now, the form is what's changing, but the meaning does not. Whether you're talking about a second aorist or first aorist, makes zero difference in terms of how you interpret it or how it's being used. And we're going to go through that here now. All right, so let's talk about in English. So past tense in English, regular verbs, we added ed or d, like I live or I lived, right? It's past tense. We add a D. Or I jump and I add an ED here because the verb ends in a consonant. So I jumped, or I stall and I stalled. Again, the verb ends in a consonant, so we add the ED. And that would be the regular form of a past tense English verb. And it's called a weak tense. I'm not sure why, to be honest, but I think it has something to do with the fact that, well, I really don't know. I mean, I'm assuming because we just added ed or d, but I haven't looked at it. But we also in English will change the form of the verb, right? I eat versus I ate. I fall versus I fell. I go versus I went. I speak versus spoke. Have versus had. Hide versus hid. So we do these things in English all the time. It's natural to us. So I don't want us to sort of feel like Greek is sort of unique or different and difficult. It's really the same thing we're doing in English. Irregular verbs that we're going to talk about, which would be like the second aorist, are formed differently. That's all that is. So instead of using like the present tense, we're going to use, and remember the imperfect is built off the present tense, right? So it's going to look very much like the imperfect, except it's going to use a different tense, like eat versus ate, fall versus fell, go versus went. It's just going to use a different tense, but it's going to be formed the same way. but from a different tense. And so in Greek, the meaning is in aorist is referring to something that is sort of undefined or in its aspect. It's sort of the whole picture, the completed action. Uh, we would generally refer this as to the perfective, and we call the perfective and imperfective. Perfective kind of action, completed or whole. And because it's going to be augmented with that epsilon, like the imperfect was, anything augmented with the epsilon is generally going to be translated into a past kind of action. Although time is not the significant factor, it's the kind of action which is going to be sort of the big picture of the whole. It's like looking at the parade from the balloon. You're at the balloon, you can see the whole parade. You may not make out the details of the parade, but you can see the big picture. That's what the aorist is, whether you're talking about first or second. And we typically translate in a very simple kind of past, I loved, ed kind of function, unless of course we're getting to ate versus eaten and that kind of stuff. Same thing. So there are two forms for the aorist in the Greek, just like there is in English, right? We got the regular and irregular. Two forms. We have the first and second aorist. We're starting with the second aorist because it's very much like the imperfect. The grammatical syntax, the grammatical structure is very much the same as the imperfect, except it uses a different tense. So the first aorist is what we would refer to as the regular or weak form in English. And we'll do that next chapter. I had one time combined this chapter, but for this class I separated it because I really want to just focus on the second aorist separate from the first. But so this first aorist we'll do next week, and it's going to be that typical we add an ed or a d ending to our English translation. Okay, and it's going to follow well, I don't want to get too far.
The second aorist is closer to what we just learned, though.
The second aorist is going to be very much the same as the
Okay.
imperfect. Okay, that's
And
why
then
we're
the
starting
first
with
is
that.
just weaker than the second.
Right. Well, it's
far as then
referred
what
to
it
as
means.
weaker. It's called the
Yeah.
regular. Basically it's the normal. But the second irregular, there's actually 40%, if I remember right, of the aorist verbs are in the second aorist. So it's quite a number. And it's referred to as irregular or strong, and it will have the same endings as the imperfect. Why? Because it's augmented with the epsilon. Okay, we're going to see that. And so it's going to use those same endings. All right, so let's talk about how it's formed. All right, so its meaning is going to, or its kind of action is going to be that perfective kind of action, completed, whole, big picture kind of action versus an ongoing, so an imperfective action versus an ongoing iterative kind of action. It's just going to be the big picture thing. So in terms of its form, we're going to add an augment, same augment we had for the imperfect, right? That epsilon. We're going to use, instead of the present tense stem, we're going to use the aorist tense stem. I'll show you the difference in a minute. And then we're going to use the same connecting vowels, the omicron or epsilon. And we're going to use the secondary active personal endings, just like we did with the imperfect, to form an second aorist active. We use the second aorist passive, or excuse me, middle endings. We'll have middle passive endings to form the second aorist middle. And talk about second aorist passive later. So, for example, the word lambano, meaning I take. In the second aorist, you see we're adding, I can write it, pretty sure I can. We're adding the augment to it, the epsilon, just like we did before. We are using now a second aorist tense, an aorist tense stem. And the difference is that if you remember, well, you may not remember it. We'll look at it here in a minute. You'll see it. That's the present tense stem for the same word, lamb, with the mu. And so it's a different tense stem for the aorist, for the second aorist. But we have the same connecting vowel, we use the same personal endings, and we get elabamen. And we. took, past tense, right? So that's how it's really structured or formed. I just want to kind of clear that up and just start. So when we look at it, again, we're going to use these first, second person, plural, singular, secondary tenses for the active voice. Then we'll do the same thing for the middle over here in a moment. We've already done these, right? You did these for the imperfect. These over here, because of this augment, the imperfect, and the aorist are all generally translated associated with a past event because of the augment. And so you already learned this, the imperfect. The only difference is the imperfect, in terms of our translation, is a imperfective kind of action, ongoing, continuous, habitual, iterative, something that has some continuation to it. But the aorist does not reflect any kind of internal aspect, only the big picture, the wholeness, the completeness of it, kind of thing. All right, making sense so far?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to ask one thing.
Yes, sir, go ahead.
So we learned the imperfective and perfective aspect last
Right.
week. Aorist is, you put up there undefined. So that means perfective.
Yes, undefined kind of action. There's no kind of action defined. It's just stated as existing or occurring.
So the
kind of
imperfect would be a defined.
Yeah, there'd be some definition to the kind of action. That's right.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so, in terms of our form, again, we have our augment. We are using the aorist active tense stem, and in this case, it's the llama, alpha, and beta, plus the connecting vowel, and our secondary personal endings for the active person, number, and voice, right? And so we get elaban, elabes, elaben, elabamen, elabete, elaban. Now, notice that this and this are the same. And only way you'll be able to differentiate between them is going to be context. Whether they're talking about a third person plural, a first person singular, generally the context will help figure that out. But we're using the same personal endings, the same connecting vowels, and the same augment. We're just using the tense stem associated with the aorist, second aorist active tense stem. Now, the reason that's important is because, well, let me show you in a minute. So the second aorist verbs do not have a tense formative. When we go to first aorist, we're going to add something to it. We're going to add the sigma alpha. Remember when we did the future? For the future, we added a tense formative. We added a tense formative, which was the sigma. When we do the first aorist, which we're not there yet, we're going to add the tense formative of sigma alpha. But for the second aorist, there is no tense formative. That's the point. I struggled with this for a very, very long time because for me, that was the aorist, that sigma alpha tense formative. And it really was hard for me to even recognize the second aorist because there is no tense formative. But when I finally came to realize that the way I recognize it is by the stem. If that stem is different than the perfect or imperfect stem, and you'll know in a minute, it's quite clear generally, then that is an aorist and not a, I kept thinking that must be an imperfect. Because look, this looks like the exact same thing as imperfect, except I'm using a different tense stem. That's the only way you're going to know the difference. Now, when you get this first aorist, we're going to have a tense formative that will tell us the difference. So when we do the middle, our second aorist middle, it's the exact same thing. A second aorist active tense stem, a connecting vowel. Then we're going to use the secondary middle passive personal endings. We've already done this, right? Our augment, our aorist active tense stem, right? That's going to be different. The omicron or epsilon, and then the secondary endings, because it's has an augment. Secondary endings, except now it's for the middle passive, right? And so we get genomen, And so it should be not hard to recognize or to understand. So now we're using here for the middle voice. Now we're not talking about passive. That's going to be different. And we'll do that, I think, in a couple of weeks. So for the middle voice and for the active voice, we're using this and this. And so there we go. For our middle, same thing. We have our augment, our aorist active tense stem, connecting vowel, personal endings, which gives a person, number, and voice. Nothing new here. You guys should be quite comfortable with this. We're just applying it to instead of a present or future or imperfect verb, now we're applying to an aorist, and it happens to be a strong or irregular form. That's why we're using the aorist active tense stem. That is going to tell us the difference between all the other tenses. Go ahead.
I just make sure I understand. Really, the only thing that's changing is that aorist part of it. Still following the same personal endings, still following the same augment and
Yeah,
everything.
in terms of the
It's
form.
just
In terms of the form, right? Obviously, what's changed in its meaning is going to be its perfective kind of action. It's completed, whole, undefined kind of action versus imperfective and ongoing, continuous, habitual, iterative kind of action.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, but in terms of the form, that looks exactly like the imperfect form, except that will not be in an imperfect form. The aorist stem, active tense stem, is not going to be because the imperfect use the present tense stem. We'll look at that. So here's what happens. All right. So sorry, my eyes are watering up. I'm just tearing up. I'm so sad.
I was gonna say such a beautiful form of language.
Yeah. Okay. Second aorist forms. Right. We're really seeing spelling changes. Okay, just like we did in English. Right. Plus the imperfect ending. Right. The personal endings. And that is a second aorist, right? So lambano is the present tense stem. That's the lexical form, lambano, right? And notice right there, lam, and then the imperfect, we got the exact same tense stem, lam, with the beta at the end. So we added our epsilon, and then we add our personal endings from the, in this case, the active secondary endings. But for the second aorist, notice that tense stem is different. The mu is not there. Remember what we said about the present. The present tense stem is really the most irregular. So the actual root for this word is, and what happens is the present tense will add the mu to it, and the imperfect follows the present. And that's why it's lambano in the lexical form for present tense, elebanon in the imperfect, and it's elabon on the for the second aorist. And so the only way to know the difference between this imperfect and this aorist is that tense stem. Does that make sense? You see what's happening?
Yeah, for the most part of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I feel like
Hesitant, yeah, but
it's all like a board game. You know, you learn the rules, but it's easier when you start actually using it
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
getting into that side of it.
Absolutely. I'm trying to spend a little time with the second aorist, and that's why I separated from the first aorist, because I did have chapters combined when I taught this before. But I know I struggle with the second aorist because for me, the first aorist, which we'll do next week, has that tense formative, and that made life so easy. You know, I mean, that was no problem. But I struggle with recognizing and even understanding the second aorist. Understand this: an aorist is an aorist is an aorist is an aorist, no matter what, right? So it's the translation, its function is going to be the same. It's a perfective kind of action. It's undefined. It's completed. It's whole. It's the whole picture, right? And generally, you have no view into the internal operation of what's going on in that action. The imperfect will give you internal view. The present will give you an internal view, but not the aorist. And so for a second aorist, the form is the same, or its structure is the same as the imperfect, except it uses a different tense stem. Because the imperfect follows the tense stem of the present. which is already, that's why we brought out earlier, the present is irregular in its tense stem, in its formation of tense stem. It's kind of backwards. We teach what the present is because it almost seems like that's the common. Well, it's not. And it's actually the irregular form. So, okay. So,
Dave,
yeah.
I think so. I guess I have a couple questions, or maybe statements. I don't know. So it's looking like it's becoming harder to try to figure out what the true lexical form is. Like, in other words, I don't know much about the first aorist at all, but if there is a tense formative, and assuming there's a sigma in there, take for instance this third line pipto, and then it changes in the imperfect to epipton, and then in the second aorist it's pesson. And I think recognizing the lexical and then the sigma, I would immediately think of, future, or obviously it wouldn't be future, it has the augment, but of maybe first. So I think just trying to, I mean, we're all new in this, but it seems like it's the trouble I'm going to have in homework and tests is trying to figure out what the lexical form is.
Yeah, you're right. You're right about that. I mean, there's no argument there. It can be difficult to recognize the lexical form, but let me give you some hints, okay? Number one, you see the epsilon, okay? That's typically going to be an augment. Now, it could be a word that starts with an epsilon, okay? So that's your first sort of puzzle piece. Is this a word that starts with the epsilon, or is this a secondary, or is this an augment with the epsilon, right? That's going to be your first clue or question. And, you might look up the word with the epsilon and find, okay, there's no such word. And so okay, let me go with an augment. And you're right. This is going to be more difficult than, say, here and also here, right? And the reason is because, and I'm going on memory now, I'm pretty sure that the root here is, okay, and what happens to this sigma is when you add the connecting vowel to it plus the connecting vowel, right, is that sigma drops because that intervocalic between two vowels, right, the epsilon here and whatever the connecting vowel is, the omicron or the epsilon, it's going to drop. And when it does drop, then this epsilon and the connecting vowel, whatever it is going to combine in some form. And that's going to start changing the different meaning. Now, I didn't look up that word to see if that is, in fact, the root, but we'll look it up real quick in the back of the book. So it's with the, okay, so we're looking at the lexical form, right? Lexical form is here. That's the lexical form, the present active. And so, no, that's not it. Okay. No, here it is, page 497. And yeah. So if I go to chapter 23, oh yeah, it's one of our vocabulary words. It will. I think Mouse gives us the root, which I love when it does that. It helps me to understand a little better. So if I go to page 246, let's see. No, I don't see him here. What chapter? What chapter is it again? Let me look again. Oh, chapter 34 is vocabulary word. Excuse me. So we'll go to chapter 34, which is way ahead of us. Vocabulary word for 34 is on page, there it is, on page 396. And okay, so the root is actually not the sigma, but not the sigma. It's actually tau. And I'd have to look to see why the sigma's added there. But we know what happens with the tau. It can drop and change when it's added to other things. Matter of fact, probably that is a dental, right? The tau is a dental. So more likely something occurred because it's a dental there and it changes. We see the tau here. We see the tau here. But you see they added the p there just like they added the mu here. So the present tense stem is going to be irregular. So you're absolutely right. It is a puzzle, but it's just something that you've got to work through. Mouse recommends you learn the root of words and then understand what's happening. And I agree. I'm just not that smart. I haven't learned all the roots. Some of them are recognizable. Some of these words, lambano, erkamai, you'll see these words over and over again, and they become very common. So you begin to just know. Others you may not see as much. Pito, I fell, or in the Aorist would be I fell. Then it may not be as recognizable. A lot of them, lambano, everywhere. I take. Erkamai, I go. Pinot, I drink. You'll see those over and over again. They become pretty common. So other than that, you learn the stems, you learn the roots, and which I never did, and that does make it harder. It does take more effort to learn those, but if you do learn those, you're going to be more. It's going to be easier to say, oh, wait a minute, that probably has a different root, a different stem.
I agree. That makes sense. And there was one thing, it was a minute ago when you said it, but the intervocalic, that was one thing I never understood because it never seemed to work. Like for the second aorist, the third one we looked at person, the sigma between two vowels, is the intervocalic just the changes that happens in between and has nothing to do
Yeah. So if I have a vowel plus a sigma plus a vowel, then not every time, okay, often though, that sigma it's intervocalic. It's in between two vowels, intervocalic. And so that sigma is going to drop, and then something happens with the two vowels. Most times they will merge, so the vowel plus the vowel will equal some other vowel or some other vowel combination. And that's what those matrices I gave you kind of help you recognize. So in this case, it's not really intervocalic because the root ends in a tau, but it's probably some dental associated. Remember the dental? We have our what was it? Noun rule 7, I think, where you have the labials, the velars, and the dentals. So you add the dental, like a delta, a tau, plus a sigma, you actually get a sigma. And I'm assuming something like that, but I'm not clear that we're adding a sigma, so I don't really know. I'd have to research that and figure it out. I don't really know. I hadn't looked at it. Yeah.
Okay.
But there's a logical reason for that sigma, I can assure you. It's not arbitrary. And it has something to do with that tau dropping out. But it's like I said, its root is a epsilon tau. So if you knew that, you could kind of figure your way through it. Now, I'm not going to sit there and memorize all those things because I'm not going to spend that much time. But some people will. If you're really going to go into Greek for like, hey, I'm going to be a scholar in Greek, you probably will learn all that stuff. But now you're learning sort of what's happening, but recognizing may not be as easy unless you spend more time in it. It's
so to kind of clear it up in my mind, it just the personal ending will always stay the same, even if there's a sigma, just floating around between two vowels. Because in my mind, I would say, oh, that needs to be parsed out even further because there's a sigma in between. But my question is, the personal ending, whether it's future, present, imperfect, is that always going to stay the same no matter? Is that why they quit parsing it out?
Okay. I don't know the answer to that. Obviously, the personal ending here, the Omicron nu did not change. We did not have an intervocalic, and the sigma didn't drop. Otherwise, this would be on, and that's not the case. So so intervocalic doesn't occur in all cases. Now, is this when we go back and look at here, we can see that there is some changes that result in it because of the intervocalic, right? This upsilon plus the sigma omicron. There's an intervocalic there. So the personal ending is the sigma omicron, but that sigma is going to drop because of the intervocalic. So that drops, and then you get the upsilon plus the omicron, which is that omicron upsilon.
Mhm.
And so you get that plus that, and that's what happens. So in this particular case, where's the on? Here we go. All right. And we got, let me just stay here. All right. So there, for a passive, there's our personal ending in tall, Omicron. Yeah, I don't know. Beyond that, right now, I don't really know.
All right, no problem. I know I'm bogging us down from our topic.
No, that's fine.
Just
We're good, man. I'd rather kind of walk through it. We got a little bit of time. All right, so here's what. Look at Lambano right here, and you see first person singular Lamban, second person Lamba. Excuse me, Elaban, Elabes, Elaben, Elabamen, Elabete, Elaban. So here, same thing. Context will tell the difference. You look at some other words. Oh, okay. So I forgot. The augment here indicates that the verb's time action generally is referred to the past. That's what augment is. It sort of refers to some sort of past kind of action. For the imperfect, it would be something that's ongoing. For the aorist, it's going to be something that's undefined. It's a completed whole. Here's a ginosco, I know, right? Lambano, I take. Ginosco, I know. And you get ignon, ignos, igno, ignomen, ignoete, ignosan. And the root for, let's see this, okay. All right, there we go. The root, let's see, yeah, because the aorist stem of ginosco is, there's the root right there. And the stem vowel, which is the Omicron, omega combines with the connective vowel, causing the tau to drop off. Yeah, I got two, which should be the tau, I think. Genomai, I be, I become, I am. Egenome, egeneto, egenometha, egenesta, and egeneonton. There we go. Notice there's a spelling change in the stem. Right here's the stem, and so that'll be the present and the imperfect. We'll see that the present tense stem used there, but once you get out of that, we're using a different tense stem. And I'm pretty sure the root is probably, I'm going to assume the root is that's the root. I'd have to look it up to be sure. And so you see other second errors. The common ones you'll see, blepo, I see. Erkomai, I come. Esto, I eat. Lego, I say. Federo, I bring. So those are the common ones. And in the aorist form, it uses a completely different stem. Some of them are so different, it's not even close. All right. Adothon. Oh, man, that don't help me. You know, how do I get from there to there? It's a different tense stem. Erkamai is elthon. It's a different tense stem. Esteo, I eat, to ethagon. Lego to apon. Federo, I bring, to a negcon. And so it's using a completely different tense stem. And those, you see, you have this augment here. There's our augment. There's our augment. There's our augment. Why are those etas instead of epsilons? Well, remember, it's with the consonant here. And well, actually, it's not always the case. That's the case. That's good. I don't know why not there. That's good.
Majority of the time the rule is that if it's with a vowel, then it's going to be lengthened to form the augment. If not, if it's a consonant, then it's going to be the eta with the soft breathing or smooth breathing.
Right. That's correct. All right, some more. Balo, I throw. It uses again a different tense stem, so it's ebelethen. And Eurisco, I find Eurisco, look what I found. Eurythen, you see, they just look so different. Let go, I say, I speak, very, very common. I can't read in this glare. Erethane, and I think that's it. No, one more. Sunago. Sunago. What's Sunago mean? I want to say it's
Synagogue?
as soon as to come together. I go. Now I have to look it up. I don't know, to be honest.
Is it synagogue? It sounds like synagogue.
It could be. It does sound like it's my first thought, but I don't want to guess that. Hold on a minute.
Synagogue.
I'm still trying to get used to Lego.
Let go, let go.
Well, not the word, but just the
Okay, now
text, the
synagogue
aorist
is not
passage.
necessarily synagogue, but it's I gather together, I bring together, I lead, right? So certainly a synagogue is a synagogue, which would be together at a place, a synagogue. Yeah. Okay, and so here's where we're pretty much near end. Okay, you have learned the present tense, both the active and middle passive. It uses the present tense stem. Just like we said, connecting vowel plus the primary active and primary middle endings, and we get luo and luomai. And then you've also learned the imperfect that's also built off the present tense stem, and it has the augment. So it's going to be a generally translated in a past kind of action, uses the same connecting vowels, uses the secondary active and middle endings. Reason is because it's augmented. And so you get let me look it up here. Eluhon and Eluamai. And then we learned a future, right? Future active, a liquid future. That's just with the lambda, mu, nu, and rho tense stem ending. And so the future middle, right? So the future active and the future liquid future active. For the future active, we have the tense formative with the sigma. With the liquid, because of the lambda mu rho tense stem ending, we add epsilon sigma for the tense formative. We use our same connecting vowels. And for the future middle, we're going to go back to the sigma. So it's the same as our future active. The only difference is for the middle passive versus the active, of course, you're going to use middle passive personal endings versus the active endings. And we hadn't done the other future ones or the first aorist. We now have picked up the second aorist, both the active and the middle. Again, there's our augment. We're using a different tense stem. That's the key. There is no augment for the second aorist. That's why this is so important. Is the only way to recognize that, the difference between that and the imperfect, is that tense stem. And same connecting vowels. We're going to use the same secondary active and middle passive endings. And that's really the difference. And so the form is going to be much like the imperfect, except it's using the aorist active tense stem. And so it's just going to look different then. And you're going to go like, what is that word? Most of which you'll recognize quite easily, that occur all the time. Lambano, erkamai, bawo, not hard. Some of which will be unique and difficult to figure out. But in terms of meaning, it also, while it looks like the imperfect, its meaning is completely different. And I don't mean its meaning in other words what the root means to whatever the verb means. I mean its kind of action. And that is in the imperfect you're going to have this ongoing, continuous, perfective kind of action. Whereas the aorist, it's always going to be the perfective kind of action, that wholeness, completeness, that kind of stuff. Okay, and that's really it until we get to vocabulary. Any thoughts on the form or the meaning of a second aorist?
Just so I understand, this is, as we were talking about, it's perfect, that it's not like I will or I was or anything like that. It is I throw or I threw.
Okay, when you use the word perfect, I don't know what you're talking about, because there's a perfect tense stem. Are you talking about a perfect tense stem? Doesn't sound like it.
No. You
Oh,
said
you said imperfect.
No, imperfect is like I will, I
No, that's future.
was, or is that okay? All right.
I will throw is a future, right?
Okay.
So if it's a
What I,
future, if it's a future, I'm gonna have to use this tense formative, either the sigma or epsilon sigma, if it has a liquid future or liquid lambda mu rho ending on the stem. So I'll have a tense formative. That will tell me, okay? It's also use a future active tense stem. The aorist, the imperfect is going to use the present tense stem, and it will be past. We'll generally translate it as past. And we put almost all these augments with the epsilon, almost all of them would translate with a past kind of action, because
okay.
that's why we're using the secondary tense endings with the active or middle, okay?
Okay.
Because
Okay.
we're going to translate it as an action relative to time. With regard to time, that's how our English translates it. Uh, but the kind of action is going to be different, whether you're talking about aorist or imperfect. Imperfect is going to be I was. What would you say? What was the verb you used?
I was, or
No, what
I
verb did you say?
will
Okay, I will serve the
throw,
future. Look, I will
like
lose. I will judge.
throw.
I will go. Imperfect. I was loosing. See we have this ing, or I was loose,
Yeah.
being loosed. Ing here shows some sort of kind of ongoing type of thing, right? Versus the aorist right here. We'll just look at these aorists here. These two second aorists. I took. It's past, just like this one was past, right? That's still past. Was past. Was past. I became, still past, became versus I am. It's still a past kind of action, but it's uh, I took doesn't say anything about I'm still, it's just an undefined kind of action. It's
Okay.
occurred. It's in the wholeness or completeness of the big picture of it. I took it. So I'm guilty. I took it. It doesn't tell me anything about how long it took or what the events of taking it occurred. Whereas the imperfect gives us some clue, ing, some kind of ongoing thing. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, now I'm going to complicate it because we have maybe 10 minutes. All right, so I want you to open your book to page, and I want to look at what the writer here puts on page 239. And I'm going to make this a little complicated, just because,
Before you make it super complicated, can I think this would be a really simple question, I hope.
sure,
Luo is like our main word.
right.
I'm wondering, and I've always wondered this, I've never asked, why, as we go down the master verb chart, it's not Luo all the way down.
Because luo, that verb doesn't, there is no second aorist for luo. It doesn't exist.
Oh.
So you have to use a different verb. Okay.
So if it doesn't exist for Luo, it's going to be replaced?
Yeah, we're going to use some other
Well,
verb
this
to help us understand the grammatical changes with that tense. Yes.
Oh. I
this
would think it'd
chart
be
and all of
Alus.
our charts go with like what's in the New Testament, though. So
There is no. I don't know about the secular koine, but I'm pretty sure there is no second aorist for luo.
okay,
Regardless,
but like with our
there is a first aorist for luo, but not
Which
a
is
second aorist. Okay.
yeah, well, even with our like lexical forms or everything, he's showing like this is how many times this is used in like the Bible as far as like the New Testament.
Yeah, yeah. And what
Yeah,
he's trying to do is show you how much you've learned already.
yeah,
Number one, you've learned this many verbs or this many words, and wow, you've learned a great percentage. I think if you learn all the vocabulary words in this book, you learned about, I think it's almost 80% or somewhere around there. I forget now, of all the verb or the vocabulary words that are in the New Testament. Of course, you got to apply the different case endings for nouns and the different personal endings and tenses and moods for verbs. But to answer your question, Jake, is that not every luo does not exist in every form, and it does not exist in a second aorist tense form. It will exist I'm pretty sure, in a first aorist, not a second aorist. That's why we have to use a different word here.
Okay.
All right, so I want to point something out, and I'm probably going to confuse you, but I can't help it. I want you to see what he writes on the end of the exegetical insight. Talks about the aorist, and he uses the word for it, the Greek word aoristos, is the indefinite tense, right? Indefinite. Uh, that states only the fact of the action without specifying its duration. So it's just an undefined. When the aorist describes an action as a unit event, a big picture, it may accentuate one of three possibilities. In other words, there's some nuances that they're going to bring out here, and they're true. The nuances are true, but the application, I think, is a question. Three possibilities. As imagine a ball that has been thrown, right? You can let it fly. That would be what's referred to as inceptive or ingressive, the beginning of the action, right? I throw the ball. I threw the ball. Okay, well, you can then look at, I threw the ball, and the action being referred to, the beginning of it, I let it fly, let it go. Versus it flew, or which is called a constitutive or durative. Constitutive and durative is something that is ongoing of some sort, continuation. I think I'm going to memory now. I think that's right. Or a hit is cumulative or ending result. In other words, you can look at an event. Right, here's our event. Right, I can emphasize the beginning of the event. I can emphasize the middle of the event. Or I can emphasize the end of the event. And that's what he's saying. All right, that yes, the aorist is the big picture, but there could be an emphasis on the beginning, the middle, or the end. Now, that can be very subjective in our translation here. But he does come to a point in Matthew 13:30 and the parallels, which, if I remember right, are Mark 13:30, and it's Luke 21:32 and Matthew 24:34, the parallels. And they're exactly the same, so it doesn't matter. And he says, and here's what it says. And of course, this is the concept of where Jesus is responding to the question, when will these things be? And he's giving this picture really talking about, we understand, predominantly associated with the destruction of Jerusalem. But then he goes on, if you notice in verse 30 of Mark, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things that take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But then in verse 32, there's a change. But of that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven or the Son or the Father alone. There's a response to a different aspect of the question, a different part of the question. But what they interpret is, and this is what I want to bring out. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things genetai. All right, genetai is that second aorist, and it's and let me shorten this up a little bit. What they're going to say is that genetai is a state of verb. A state of verbs talks about state of being, right? I am, to be, was, is. Those are state of verbs. I am hungry. That's a state of verb. I am. I was hungry. It's a state of verb. I'm becoming hungry. Becoming. That's a state of verb. There's no action, associated with it. A constitutive would be an action relative to it. But the state of kind of thing just says it's there's no action for the verb to do. There's no object that I hit the ball. There's no action for the verb. So a state of verb says there's no kind of action, right? So genetai is that state of kind of verb. Difficulty lies in the fact that Jesus has already described the end of the world in verse 24-25. Where there we might differ. And this is where translation becomes an issue here. Is our baseline for understanding how genetai is being used in verse 30, they're building it on the fact that their interpretation of verse 24 and 25 is built on the fact that their view is that's the end of the world. Well, is it? Or is it the end of the Jerusalem as they knew it? And that's the case because they're using these hyperbolic images of judgment, of destruction, the sun and the moon and all giving away and falling stars falling from the sky. And that, in fact, is really talking about just a time of judgment, not necessarily the end of the world. People see that as the end of the world, but that's not the case. In every case, in most cases, it's not. And so the expression, this generation, gene, aute, this generation, is stretched to include the entire age from Jesus' first to second coming. So, and then a less likely option, the aorist genetai must provide the clue. So if we view that, so in other words, you're saying, hey, the star's falling, the sun losing its light. It's not likely that's going to be an ongoing thing, right, from now until the end of the world. So they're using that as a basis to get their clue, saying this generation is stretched to include the entire age of Jesus from first to second coming, less likely of an option. The aorist genetai then is the clue for them. And if we view the verb as an ingressive aorist, in other words, I got this undefined event, but I'm going to emphasize the beginning, not the middle, not the end, but the beginning, right? And this ingressive aorist to translate from the perspective of initiated action and saying it may be rendered, I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things begin to come to pass. Oh, that's a different translation. In other words, when these things begin, then you know the end is coming. Well, wait a minute. First off, Jesus said you won't know the end is coming. That's the difference between verse 32. But in that hour and that day, not even the angels in heaven, no one knows, nor the Son, but the Father alone. So to recognize the beginning is problematic, just theologically. So anyway, I want to bring these kind of things up so you can start thinking through this stuff. As we move further along, I want to dive a little deeper in terms of not just the basic grammar, right? Second aorist, okay, we understand what it looks like, we understand how it's translated, but now there's some nuances. And if you look at almost every translation, I looked this morning, none of them translated as beginning to come to pass. Okay, none of them do. So they're inserting a bias here that is built upon an assertion or an interpretation for verse 24 and 25. And those are the kind of things. And so to justify their position, that's the key. They need now to translate, to justify verse 24 and 25 as a end of time. Oh, the stars are falling, everything. The world is coming to an end. To justify their position, that is what that passage is talking to, then they go to genetai and say genetai is a state of verb. It is a second aorist, and ultimately it's referring to the beginning. And it's a possibility, but context doesn't help here. It doesn't help justify their position. And that's what I want to bring out. There's more to it that we can go into, and I might bring that up again next week so we can dive a little deeper into it. I want to begin diving a little deeper without confusing too much. You got to understand the basic, okay? What a second aorist looks like, and how it functions. It functions as a complete undefined picture, but there are nuances to that function. Am I looking at the whole picture as just the whole picture, or is there an emphasis on the beginning of that whole picture, or an emphasis on the middle, or an emphasis on the end? Any of those could occur. And the more we go deeper, the more that you see that's a possibility. So hopefully I didn't confuse you too much.
No, I was gonna say that's where, like, what it's talking about, that's where context kind of helps with
Absolutely.
what we're doing, instead of, like, let fly, it flew, or it hit, the context helps us know which side of that picture we're looking at.
Yeah, and it's still going to be, and we're not going to get all the answers all in every case. We may still struggle with some of this, but in this case, I think context. If we have a firm foundation of what the context is referring to, right? You have to go back. What questions being asked, right? And there's 2 to 3 questions being asked, and then which ones is he answering? And you can see a difference. We've looked at this, and you guys have learned. I know. I assume you have, like in Matthew 24. I think it's in verse 36. There's a clear difference where now he's talking about the end of the world, the end of time. Where prior to that, he's talking predominantly about the end of destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 time frame when the Romans come and destroy Jerusalem. And here we see the same thing in Mark 13. We see the same thing in Luke 21. But if you don't make that differentiation, you have to then justify okay, are these stars falling from Jesus' time until he comes again? The answer is no. Well, how do we then interpret that? Well, we interpret that by doing putting a nuance, which is a possibility in genetai, and ultimately, if you start with the wrong foundation, you're going to keep building with more error, and that's kind of
Yeah.
what is happening here. Now, I do want to point out though, if you don't have, I do want to order if you don't have it. We're going to move further and further into this Greek grammar beyond the basic. This is not by Mouse, but Daniel B. Wallace. I don't know, I'm pulling this up like you can see it. I don't know if you can or not.
I can see it.
Okay, we're gonna get that. It's actually in Logos, by the way. And I want to read a little bit. I got a couple more minutes. Well, I've got one more minute. All right, so the aorist, it talks about the aorist tense on page, this is page, by the way, if you have it, 558. Aorist tense may be used to stress the beginning of an action or an entrance into an action. So it can be. There's it goes about the different nuances, an aggressive kind of aorist. Unlike the aggressive imperfect, right? So an imperfect can talk about not just something ongoing, but emphasize the beginning of something that's ongoing. Unlike the aggressive imperfect, there's no implication the action continues. In other words, aorist it's not going to give us a continuing kind of action. It's just going to say, here's the event. But it could be emphasizing the beginning of that event. But it's not an ongoing beginning, just the beginning of it. That's what he's saying. So the aggressive aorist is quite common. Here's where he says it occurs. The use of the aorist is usually shut up to two different kinds of verbs. Right? Two different kinds of verbs. One, it occurs with stative verbs. So the aggressive aorist occurs with stative verbs. Well, genetai is a stative verb. And so that can justify this aggressive, this beginning emphasis of the undefined action. I'm saying this over and over because I'm trying to embed it. So it occurs with a stative verb in which the stress is on the entrance into the state. And that's what they're translating there. And so it also denotes verbs. It also occurs with verbs denoting activities, especially in context where the action is introduced as a new item in the discourse. Those are action verbs. It's not stative verbs. Many errors should be treated as aggressive or constitutive. Constitutive is like an action verb. I think I'm going to memory. I probably have it wrong. I'll look it up later. Treated as an aggressive, depending upon what the interpreter sees as the focus. That's what's happening. There's not always a hard and fast distinction between them. The key to identifying, like begin or to do or became, the force of the aorist may be brought out by the gloss to begin to do or to became with stative verbs. So begin to do with active verbs, that's constitutive, and became with stative verbs like genetai. Recall that the imperfect idea began doing and is an expression of that connotes continuation of that kind of action. So what he's saying is that it's possible that genetai could have an emphasis on the beginning. But when we look at this in the context, and he doesn't say, he's not actually referring to this event. He's just saying stative aorist verbs can have an emphasis on the beginning of that undefined action.
Yeah.
And so some people are running with that. But if you look at every translation, none of them do that. I'd say none. I look at all. None of them actually do that. None of them say begin. And none of them say begin when all these things begin to take place. None of them do. And I think the reason is because context generally doesn't point to that. And so anyway, I wanted to bring that out because there's a lot of different ways you can. No one Greek is going to give you all the answers, but it will help you to understand what they're talking about and be able to agree or refute it, whatever the case might be. Hopefully, I didn't go on too much.
With like, I don't want to get too deep into that side of it, but with the context is you go back to like Daniel when Jesus is or when Daniel talks about how the Romans are going, this other nation, is going to come in and destroy again. And so, there's context with it, and Jesus is showing that side of it, that this other nation's going to come and destroy Jerusalem.
Yeah.
I looked up constitutive definition, a sentence that is a statement declaring something to be the case.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Appreciate that. This is a declaration of fact.
Yeah.
Okay, Jake, you look like I threw you for a loop, and I'm sorry, I apologize about that. But we could dive a little more next week in this too as well. if we have questions or problems. I want us to start moving a little deeper because I want us to start moving into Greek reading here. Not now. I want to probably another 2 or 3 weeks before we do that, but I want to start moving into reading and a little more grammar, a little more depth on the grammar side. So,
I was muted. But
unless I'm losing you guys, then I have to back off.
I'm gonna be honest. I didn't understand much. I understood to a degree of what you were just mentioning there, but I'll have to go back and look at the exegetical.
Sure.
On my mind, I meant to ask the question before it started, but I didn't get it in. It
Sorry,
was,
go ahead.
we're going through perfective, and so it brings up the old question we raised. If you have a second aorist, bear with me here, second aorist perfective verb, you're going to translate it as a second aorist perfective verb. But because it's undefined, that verb, although it's always going to be translated as perfective, it could be imperfective or punctiliar, although it's never going to be translated that way.
No, it can never be. It can never be imperfective or punctiliar. It's going to be.
I agree.
Okay.
It never can, but context can give clarity on the situation and show that it was a continuous thing or it wasn't, although it was defined.
No, that's not what we said.
Okay.
It is still an undefined action, but if I want to emphasize the beginning or moving into that action, then that's called ingressive, right? So I have an undefined action. I don't really know much about it, but if the emphasis is on the beginning of it or moving into that action or that state, let's say state of being, really, that in this case, genetai is a state of being. If I want to emphasize the moving into the state of being, right? The state of being is to be, I've been baptized into Christ. The state of being is I'm a new creature now, right? That's a new state, okay? State of being. You could emphasize that's an undefined, completed whole action, right? But you could emphasize going into it, or you can emphasize living in it, the middle. So the whole action, going into it, living in it, or the end of it, the end results. There could be an emphasis in the context that helps you bring something out, but in no way is it a particular or is it ever continuous. It's not talking about the beginning and the beginning goes on. It's talking about moving into the beginning, or maybe in that I live a life in the middle, or the end result might be the emphasis of it, but it's still an undefined action, and context might give us a little more emphasis on whether entering in it or living in it, or maybe the end kind of thing.
Yeah. So it's still perfective action.
Right.
And my question is, if like 2 or 3 Greek sentences later, it said, let's say the imperfective action was second aorist, I ate. And then like 2 or 3 sentences later in the Greek, it says, well, I ate and I never stopped eating, for the rest of my life. That would show a continuous action, although it was, that's where my confusion comes in.
All right, so let's put the two together. Okay, so number one, if I ate is going to be the first part of the context here. That's still going to be a undefined action. Period. Don't change that. Okay.
Right.
Now I may want to put the emphasis. That the eating began. I moved into the beginning of eating, but it's not going to keep on beginning, right? I may want to put the emphasis on the fact that I'm done eating, but I'm not going to be like continuing to be done eating. So it's still an undefined action, and I may or may not have emphasis in one, in called ingressive or telic, the end. I may put some emphasis there, but I'm not. None of those are continuing in some form. None of them. There's no, I'm going to keep beginning or I'm going to keep ending. But now the second part of the context may say, it maybe uses the imperfect verb and says, well, or maybe uses the perfect verb, which we hadn't got to yet. So that will have its own understanding. And yes, you have to look at the whole as a context, but
I think
its initial usage is going to be the undefined usage. Another usage may be different, and then you want to understand why are they different. Okay, why are they different?
And my
Why did
question,
the author choose to make this different? That would be the context of the key that you want to ask. But it doesn't change the initial versus the secondary usage of it, the second usage of it.
right? And that's what I'm agreeing and thinking about. I'm just my mind. It's hard to reconcile the fact that it's undefined, meaning that there is some context there, but you just don't.
Well, okay, if I ate last night,
Hmm.
you don't know anything about my eating or anything. There's just
Right.
the fact occurred. That's it. It's a statement of fact.
Right.
Nothing else occurs. Now, if I want to say I was eating, there's some indication that eating was some continuing event of some sort.
Exactly.
And obviously it's still past because the word was. Ate is still past because it's past. So there's a difference in what's being expressed. I ate doesn't give me any definition of the event itself. It's just that it occurred. That's it. That's all you know. It did in fact occur. But you don't have any definition of the event, internal, like eating iteratively, continuously.
In that verb, in that sentence.
Right, absolutely. There's nothing there.
But later, it could be shown that maybe I'm conflicting.
You're conflating the context with its usage in the sentence is going to be its usage. Now, context may give us greater nuance or association with how the author intended it.
That it could be continuous.
No,
not the verb, but the action.
It cannot be continuous. It cannot be continuous.
Really? Okay.
It will. If it was continuous, he would have used the imperfect for past kind of action or present or something. He'd use a different tense. Okay, so the tense is what it is, and it's going to give a certain understanding of what the author is trying to express. And if he's using the aorist tense, he's just expressing the action occurred. That is it.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm with you there.
All right. Now, if he uses the same verb in a different tense later on, then again, that's talking about that's usage. Now, within the context, I might want to understand why did you switch? What's happening here? Or if I look at the undefined makes it hard because it's like, oh, there's no definition. I struggle with that myself. No, it's just a completed whole picture. It's undefined in terms of the details of what's going internally, right? I'm in the big balloon. I see the whole parade, and I can see that's it, right?
You're aware of what's ongoing eternally.
Right, exactly. That's all undefined means, is that I can't see the internal depth or details of what's happening. I just know that it happened, period.
Which is where my confusion comes in.
Okay.
But well, I know class has already started for the preacher. I need to get to it.
Yeah. All right. We'll pick it up next week. All right.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Dave. Appreciate you.
Bye.